Hey, good morning, everyone. I feel like I should say aloha. I got my Hawaiian t-shirt that I bought in Hawaii to just kind of change it up a little bit. Today, I want to take a look at Genesis 47. We are still trying to wrap up the School of God series. And I think it's going to be really, really good because it really did touch my heart as I was preparing for this message. Now, the title of the message is titled In the Palm of God. In the palm of God. And I was thinking, because this week I was walking and doing my prayer walk, and I was just asking the Lord, what does that look like to me in my life? And I felt like in the palm of his hands, our life is in his control. It is in his protection, but also he knows exactly how we feel. Every movement, he feels it in the palm of his hands. Now, I want to tackle a theological doctrine that I believe perhaps has been forgotten because we feel we are controlling our own life. And the doctrine is the providence of God. Now, what does it mean when I say in the providence of God? It is a foreshadowing, or like God knows exactly how to provide in the things that are to come, and he often does it intimately and in detail, and nothing is ever wasted. Now, I think I shared this story with you, but this story is so good, I have to share it with you once again. Obviously, you know, one of my spiritual heroes is Billy Graham. And he's someone that I really look up to because he was truly a man of God. Now, there's a story where he used to preach and serve in a mission organization called Youth for Christ. And the founder of that mission organization, Tori Johnson, was supposed to speak at an event for youth in Chicago. But for some reason, he couldn't make it. And the organizers of that meeting said, you know what, Tori, if you are not coming, we're just going to cancel it. And he said, no. I have someone in place. He is a man of God. He will passionately speak the word of God. So I'm sending them to you. And they kept on responding by saying, no, if you are not coming, we prayed about you. You're supposed to speak at this event. If you're not coming, we're going to cancel it. And Tori, as graciously but authoritatively said, have him. And he's going to go and he will bless many. And do you know who that was? It was a 26-year-old Billy Graham who was starting out in his full-time itinerant speaking ministry. And he went. It was sometime in May of 1945. Can you imagine that? A 26-year-old Billy Graham, and I'm sure he was fiery, passionate, asking people to come and lay their knees and feet at the altar of God and commit their lives for Jesus Christ. So he preached his heart out, is what legend has it. And Tori called him later and said, Billy, what happened? Did any youth commit their life to Jesus Christ? And Billy kind of shook his head and said, I did my very best. I preached my heart out, but for some reason, I just had one student that gave his heart and his life to Jesus. And Tori Johnson asked him, hey, do you remember his name? Did you write it down on a piece of paper so that you can continue to pray for him? And guess what the name was? It was Warren Wiersbe. He was one of the greatest expositors in our generation. He also pastored Moody Bible Church in Chicago and wrote many books that he authored. And this is an amazing story. Now, could Billy have known? Could Tori have known? Could any of us have known other than the providence of God? And I believe it was the kindness of God that spoke into not only Tori, but also Warren and Billy and all those kids that were there. Now, whenever I hear that story, I get chills because I'm like, that is an amazing story. Who could have ever known? Friends, we think we know so much at the moment, but we know so little of the grand weaver's plan for my life, for your life, and our plans for the future. But all I have to say is in the palm of God's hand, in all of history, his finger is intimately involved and his imprint is all over history. This is what I mean by God's providence. In Genesis chapter 47, we will get to see the providence of God, but it comes in this form. Are you ready for it? It's the kindness of God. Now, I don't know what kind of caricature you have drawn about God, but in my history, when I've lived in sin, when I fell at the bottom of the pit, where I felt like I needed help from my Father, instead of chastising me, it was always the kindness of God that would usher me into the palm of his hands, and he would utter this proclamation. It wasn't revelation in the things that we think are new. It's a reminder of the things that we know already. You know what it was? Paul, I love you, and I have a mighty plan for you. This is the kindness of God, because if you look at Genesis 47, and if you remember from last week, Genesis 46, Jacob uprooted everything to take that long trek to go to Egypt. It was no easy journey. There was spiritual investment on the part of Jacob. At his advanced age, he picks up everything he has. He leaves the promised land, the only land that he has known for quite some time, but he walks into an unknown future. The tail end of Genesis 46, we see Joseph kind of quiz his brothers. When you meet with Pharaoh, I want you to say these words. But what he is saying is, be as honest and truthful as possible. Why? Why did Joseph do that? Not only is he a strategist, but he also knew how Pharaoh operates. So when they answered honestly as to what is your occupation, and they said, we are shepherds, basically what ends up happening is Pharaoh honors their truthfulness and gives them the best part of land in a place called Goshen. Now, of course, we have to give credit to Joseph's strategy, but ultimately it is the providential hand of God that comes in a form of kindness to his people. If you really think about it, they should not have expected a warm reception from Pharaoh. There were 70 in total. They should have not been accepted in this way. But all that I know is human beings are not in control. Pharaoh is not in control. You know who is? God is in control. Now, one of the great blessings in the providence of God is God rewards faith. Now, hear that again. God rewards faith. He always eventually does. Because we know that God is in full control, but I want you to remember this. Just because we move in faith, just because we act in faith, does not mean God will reward his people immediately. But here in this instance, we see God provide for the clan of Jacob immediately. Now, I have to say this. You know, sometimes doing the right thing when it comes to a life with God doesn't always bring immediate provision. It sometimes provokes evil, and the world is against us. But nonetheless, the plan of God and the desire of God is to always reward for faith. What does it say in Scripture? That we cannot please God. It is impossible to please God without what? Faith. So we see God's reward due to the faith of Jacob. Jacob uproots everyone, his whole family, all that he has from the land of promise. He commits to dying in a strange land, a pagan land, and God rewards the faith to obey in Jacob with kindness in his providence. Do you know what he's actually doing? God is confirming that his hand is upon Jacob's family. Sometimes we need to experience the kindness of God and the providence of God. Why? Because we just don't know if this is the will of God. And he often shows up in the most perfect timing just to say, hey, you're on the right track. I know it's difficult. I know it's painful, but I have you in the palm of my hand, and my kindness will come, and I will shower you with love. So let's read verse 5 and 6. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. If you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. Isn't that amazing? Favor upon favor. Even how Pharaoh responds with even more blessing. He even welcomes them. He gives them the best of land. They roam in freedom. It's at their disposal. And he even says, you know what? If there are people who are gifted enough, you can take care of my own personal livestock. I remember about 4 or 5 months ago, my wife and I were kind of praying, Lord, did we make the right decision as we planted Woven? Because there are times in the church plant life, I never knew because I never planted a church. But I was like, man, this is difficult. Coming from an established church where everything is set up and I just have to go and do what I've been trained and I'm very used to doing, this was all brand new territory for me. And there were moments where I was just like, I'm just not sure. I'm not seeing the results. I'm experiencing too much difficulty. I'm doubting myself. And there's something that happened that allowed us to experience the kindness of God. And we knew that we were on the right track. It didn't mean that it was going to be, coasting from here on out. It just meant, Lord, you are with me. You know exactly what I'm going through. The difficulty that I've been struggling with, the fear of failing, the fear of what if this doesn't work out, the doubts that were clawing at my heart and my mind. You showed a little bit of kindness, and it was like when I was thirsty, you drenched me with your presence and your kindness. This is what Jacob is experiencing. And I pray that blessing over you as well. Some of you are walking this journey and maybe you are questioning, did I make the right choice? Am I on the wrong path? I want to guarantee you, God will never waste anything, but He will invite Himself, intervene with the providence of God, and He will say, you're on the right track. Now in verse 7 to 10, I love it. Jacob finally gets to meet Pharaoh. Like, you have to understand, Pharaoh is seen like a god to the Egyptians. But what do we see? Not only simple pleasantry, hey, how old are you? Why would Pharaoh ask Jacob how old he was? Well, back in those days, longevity of life also meant the proof of blessings from heaven above. But I love in verse 7 and 10 where it specifically says what? Jacob blessed Pharaoh. I love that. I love it. Not only are we seeing spiritual connection and him blessing the most powerful person in the world at that time, but what I see beyond all of that amazing picture of Jacob laying hands on Pharaoh and blessing, this is what I see. God is faithful to His promise. Why? Because this scene reminds me of Genesis 12, when God made a promise and a declaration over who? Abraham, to say, I will make you into a great nation, and people, you will be a channel of blessing. What's happening with Jacob right now? He is being a channel of blessing. You see, the promises of God, no matter how generations pass, it is still active. Church, know this. Friends, know this. The promises of God over your life is active. It hasn't ended. It hasn't expired. God is in the midst of doing something. Ask the Lord, show me more. Show me more. Enlarge my capacity to know more of the plans of God. Now, He won't show you everything. Why? Because if we know everything, we take control. We take over. So the promises of God is still in play, still active, and we see Jacob playing out the promises of God all the way back from Genesis 12, and he blesses Pharaoh. You see, in the eyes of the world, especially to the Egyptian world, Jacob is not seen as a great or even superior person. In a worldly sense, he is the lowest of the low. But God uses Jacob to bless Pharaoh. And in this is yet another proof of the providence of God. Jacob, unknown about what's going to happen in the future, but he uprooted everything, a spiritual investment and commitment into the future, because even though he didn't know, he knew that God knew. And this was just yet another kindness from the Lord saying, Jacob, I see you. Isn't it amazing that you're seeing the promises that I made to your forefathers, Abraham, and you're experiencing just a little bit of the promises of God? So what's the kingdom truth in this? If what God has promised doesn't happen, guess what? It will happen through your children. Bless be to God. That's why it's so important for us to raise our children, disciple them, discipline them in the Word of God now. Some of the greatest massacres that we have seen is not Christianity being attacked. It is that in the home, Christianity and Jesus is not central. We are seeing far too many of our children in the next generation depart from the church, leave the faith. Why? Because they have not seen it exhibited in their parents' life. This is the encouragement to you all. Even though you don't necessarily see this right now, it's going to happen to your children. So prepare them to walk in the promises of God, but see God who's behind the promise, and He is the promise keeper. This is the kindness of God, that even though you won't fully see it now, it's going to happen. And this is the wonderful providence for us. Now in verse 11 and 12, while the rest of Egypt is subjugated to Pharaoh because of the famine, Jacob's family is able to do what? They're able to grow and prosper. Isn't that totally opposite of what it means to be in a season of famine? In famine, no crops, no growth, no prosperity happens. But what happens to those who walk in the promises of God? They respond in faith and commit themselves into an unknown future. God knows that commitment. He honors it, but providing for them not only a place to live, a land, and get this, they're going to be separated just enough that they will become what? A great nation. They will be consecrated, that they will be isolated just enough that they will become a great nation. You see, there is blessing when we start to think of some of the great things that God has done. Even in the midst of difficulty, even in the midst of this pandemic, don't you realize that there are great things happening right now in your life? You are spending more time with your children than you would have ever have done. And this is a great moment. Yes, sometimes our patience goes through the roof, and sometimes all of that. But we will never get this season ever in life if we never had this. So this is a great moment. This is a great moment for even a small house church like ours, that we have people worshiping with us in different states. Can you believe that? I would have never imagined that that would have ever taken place. I would have never imagined that I would be speaking to a camera and preaching. I would have never imagined that I would have been part of a worship that had no call and response. Like I'm saying something, I don't hear anything back. But I just think that this is a heart to grasp. Be thankful despite the famine. Be thankful despite the pandemic, for God is a God who has provided. He will continue to provide, and He is perfectly abiding just what we need. Be thankful. You see, the severity, and if you read the rest of verse 13 to the end of the chapter, verse 31, like basically what you start to see is the great severity of the famine. Famine is no joke. It cannot be ignored. You know, Pharaoh has enslaved all of Egypt, but for some reason, Jacob's family is free through the provision of Pharaoh. Jacob's family is spared, and you can start to appreciate how kind God's providence is in bringing the whole family to Egypt. Isn't that amazing? He has led you up to this point. Trust in him. I'm saying that over my life, and I'm saying that over your life. Trust. And just because things do not happen as you have imagined, still trust. You trust until you trust. Now, why do I say this? Because I think right now, in the midst of the pandemic, and we hear stories about, hey, you know, the worst is yet to come, the second wave and whatnot. But I want to say this. This is what we need to grasp a hold of in this season. It's the providence of God in the palm of God's hand, is that in all the setbacks of your life as a believer, God is planning for your joy and your promise. He upholds all things. He governs all events. He directs everything to an appointed end. He does all the time, and he does all things in all circumstances. He always does it for his glory. So I want to share with you a little bit of a synopsis and a summary just so that we can sit on this doctrine. I think it's good for us to know doctrine, right? Yeah, it's great to move in the Spirit, but it's got to be grounded in the Word, right? That our worship ought to be pleasing. So there are three things that I want to share, and I study this a little bit just to make it easier for you. First, the doctrine of God's providence teaches us several important truths, and we gain that from Genesis 47. First, God cares about the tiniest details of life, meaning what? You are never small. You are never too small for God to pay attention to you. See, nothing escapes his notice, for he is concerned about every small thing as well as big things. In fact, with God, there is no big or small. He knows when a sparrow falls. He numbers the hairs on your head. He keeps tracks of the stars in the sky and the rivers that flow to the ocean. He sets the date of your birth, the day of your death. He ordains everything that comes to pass in heaven. He cares about the tiniest details of your life. Isn't that amazing? The kindness of God. Second, he uses everything and wastes nothing. What you are going through, it's not wasteful. You have worth. You have value. Everything that you have experienced, he will use it in his good providence in the palm of his hand. There are no accidents with God, only incidents. I love that. No accidents with God, only incidents. And this includes events that seems to us too senseless of a tragedy. Third, God's ultimate purpose and the providence of God is to shape you into the image of Jesus Christ. And do you know he often uses difficult moments and even human tragedies to teach this truth? The doctrine of God's providence is really a combination of a lot of things. He's in control. He's in charge of how things will turn out. He makes no mistakes, and he has our best interest at heart. I love what R.C. Sproul once said, God doesn't roll the dice. Nothing happens by chance ever. That's why when people say around me, oh, that was lucky. I was like, no, what are you talking about? There's no luck with Christians. It's all in the providence of God. That even the mistakes he will use, even in your sin, he will redeem, even in your celebrations, he will multiply. With God, everything is in the palm of his hand, and he's going to do great things for his glory. I close with this. In the first 3 months of me planting the church, it was something that was completely foreign, and I was walking and praying because, you know, as a church planter, you don't really have a whole lot of other things to do, just praying. And this has been a great season. And this is what he always said to me, Paul, I have you in the palm of my hands. I mean, he said that so many times that I'm thinking, I must be going crazy. I'm hearing things that I want to hear. But I asked one person to pray for me, and do you know what they said? the first thing they said was, Paul, God has you in the palm of his hands. In God's providence, it comes in kindness. It comes in goodness, but ultimately, he controls everything. He's in charge of how everything turns out. He makes no mistakes, and he has the best interest in mind. Friends, be blessed. God knows you, and he has the best things in store for you.